Hello, Internet! I'm Elliot the Purple Air Doofus, and welcome back to American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Today we're covering chapters 17 and 18. I hope you've read up to that point because I do not want to ruin anything for you. Especially because these chapters pretty much sum up the general story. There's a couple more chapters after this to hopefully tie up some loose ends, but this one really gets to the meat of the ending. So if you don't want me to spoil that for you, read the chapters before you watch this video. Chapter 17 is describing Rock City, which is the most powerful place in America for all of these old and new gods, and how there are a lot of gods setting up camp on either side, old and new, getting ready to go to battle with each other. Around Rock City, there's a place called Lookout Mountain. A lot of gods that are kind of on the fence on whether or not to fight or not are still really interested in watching the fight itself, so they are sitting at Lookout Mountain looking down on Rock City. Laura wakes up, sees Shadow. She says to Shadow, I'm thirsty, and Shadow says, go to the barn. There's a well. Ask the women there for water. And so Laura is off, and she goes to the barn, and there's 3 women. The same 3 women that tied him up. And Laura asks them for water, and they show her to a well, which is the Well of Time. And she drinks from it. She pukes up a lot of maggots and dead things inside of herself. And it kind of rejuvenates her, but not completely to life, kind of washing away the decay of being dead. Then we have a section where Computer Boy is talking with a bunch of the new gods, and none of the other gods are named, but I think one of them might have been Therapy, because she goes up to Computer Boy and she says, now how does that make you feel? Mr. World was the other agent that was at the passing of the body, and he is describing to Mr. Town how the fight is going to go down. He has the 2 factions of gods on either side, takes like a twig, and he shows that he's going to have a twig flying over the fight. They're going to say something to the effect of, to Odin! And then the twig is going to turn into a spear, puncture the other side. And Mr. Town says, which side would it puncture? And Mr. World says, it doesn't really matter, as long as it was punctured in Odin's name. So he tells Mr. Town to go get a branch from the same tree that Shadow had been hanging from for the past 7 or 8 days. And Mr. Town, being the submissive little agent that he is, just goes off and does it. We catch up with Easter. You remember her, the incredibly pale god who is incredibly rich at the same time. And she's like, I am so rich, I need not for anyone. And she is at the lookout point, and she decides that she is going to catch up with Shadow because nothing is happening on the battlefield right now. Town has his branch, and he's driving back to Mr. World when he picks up a hitchhiker. Throughout the entire section, I'm thinking, oh, this must be Crow. I don't know why she's getting mixed up in this, but Crow is the only hitchhiker we've had so far. And then we find out that I'm incredibly wrong, and he picked up Laura. And things are about to get interesting between the 2 of them. Computer Boy goes to Mr. World, and he's complaining because Mr. World isn't using any high-tech weaponry. And he says, they have spears and swords and shields, and we have frickin' smart bombs. Why aren't we using that on the gods? And Mr. World kind of says, I've had enough of you. And he takes a knife and he jams it like right underneath Computer Boy's chin. And he says, for Odin. And he kills Computer Boy. Jerk. In the next chapter, we catch up with Shadow, who is in the empty black nothingness. And he catches up with Whiskey Jack. And Whiskey Jack urges him to go back to the living world. And Shadow is listening to Whiskey Jack, and all of a sudden the darkness becomes so bright that it burns him, and he wakes up. The story backtracks a little, and we have Easter and Horus, the eagle god of the Egyptians, and they are at the tree with Shadow still hanging from it. And it comes to the end of the 9 days, and they both work on untying Shadow and cutting him loose from his restraints. While at the battlefield of Rock City, all of the gods are starting to set up almost like a chess game, very defensively or offensively, depending on who they are and what they can do. We get a glimpse into the car ride with Laura and Mr. Town, and we find that Mr. Town is developing a huge crush on Laura. Laura is just kind of playing along with it. Mr. Town mentions Mr. Wood and Mr. Stone, who got killed, and Laura says, would you like to know what happened to them? Mr. Town says, of course I would. The book literally says, and then Laura showed him. So yeah, she kills Mr. Town and takes his stick that he got from the tree. Now that Shadow has been cut down and given some water, and he can move around a bit, Easter gives him an egg, and he's confused because he's gotten coins from everyone else. It's very symbolic to Easter, but it's not that incredibly important. And then a thunderbird kind of flies overhead, and he's like, do I get to, can I, whoop, with the... And Easter's like, well, you're going to have to ask the thunderbird, because I can't tell you. So Laura goes to Mr. World, who is kind of overseeing the war, and Mr. World says, oh, you have my stick. I assume that you killed Mr. Town just as you killed Mr. Wood and Mr. Stone. And she says, yes, of course. And Mr. World starts smoking a cigarette, and she's like, can I have one of those? And he says, can I have my stick? And she says, not for just a cigarette. This thing is far too powerful for just a cigarette. And so she starts getting answers from him. And then we see Shadow, and he is riding the Thunderbird, having the time of his life, screaming from the skies. I'm sorry, that was the Thunderbird. Let's try that again. Okay then, I have something in my throat. Laura is talking with Mr. World, and Mr. World is putting the moves on her, and he's getting closer and closer to her, and he's like bordering on groping her by how close he is. She has enough, and she picks up the stick, and she screams, "For Odin!" And the stick turns into a spear, and she jams it into her chest, which not only goes through her, but also through Mr. World. Punctures them both. Shadow lands in the backstage area that he and Mr. Wednesday had traveled through to get to the Indian reservation, and he starts talking with a voice that just so happens to be Mr. Odin. And Odin is telling Shadow that he has never been disappointed by Shadow, which is very touching to hear from a father. And then Mr. World shows up. Only Shadow doesn't know him as Mr. World. Shadow knows him as Loki. And Shadow says, I know what you two have both been up to. But not before he sees Loki and says, what the hell happened to you? And he says, your wife just speared me in the chest. And he asks where she went off to, and, he points somewhere. Shadow continues on with his brilliant detective work, and he says, I know what you two have been up to. You've been playing a con game with all of the gods. You've been playing a two-person con game. Your whole idea was to get the new gods and the old gods to fight in Odin's name. They ask why Loki would be in on this, or why he would want this. And Shadow says, it's because Loki craves chaos. And gods fighting together in one small area? What is more chaotic than that? And I'm just kind of like, that's kind of brilliant. It's kind of amazing. It kind of explains everything. If enough gods kill in the name of Odin, Odin can come back. And if there is enough chaos, Loki can survive the puncture wound. But since he spread it around to Easter and Horus, and they spread it around to all the other gods, they aren't fighting. So Loki dies. Odin doesn't get to go back into Mr. Wednesday's body. And even though Odin was defeated, he kind of still turns to Shadow and says, I have never been more proud of my son. And it's just kind of like, you? Those two gods die, and Shadow goes off to meet with Lauren. And Lauren is crumpled in the fetal position, still with the coin around her neck. And she looks worse for wear, but she can still talk. And she's like laying in a pool of her own blood. She asks Shadow, did you find out a way to make me live? Shadow says, I know of one way. Do you want me to do that? And Lauren, she says no. And so Shadow kind of nods solemnly, and he reaches out and he grabs on to the coin around her neck. and he pulls it. And she dies. And that's the end of the section. And after I read that, I just kind of had to crawl into a ball and cry for a bit. Because I was sad. The question I have for you today is, can you think of any memorable loose ends that have been in a story, either a book or a movie or whatever kind of story that you have been interested in and found a loose end and wanted to be like, well, the question that I had yesterday was, what is your favorite device of choice between heaven or hell? One that was very memorable to me and it always kind of stuck with me was, it was a Looney Tunes cartoon, so you know it's just complete BS, but I believe it was Sylvester. He gets crushed by a T-bar. His ghost kind of gets up from his body, and he's wobbling, and he has two options. He either gets to choose to go to hell down the escalator, or go to heaven up an escalator. I was like, you mean when we die, we get to choose whether or not we go to heaven or hell? At that moment, when we die? Why would anyone choose hell? That sounds awesome! Yeah, I was a naive little kid. Do not forget that the next book that I'll be reading is The Indisputable Proof of Santa Claus by Dr. Hannah Fry. I don't actually have the... Wait! Package! I do have the book here! Ha-ha! The Indisputable Existence of Santa Claus by Dr. Hannah Fry and Dr. Thomas Orlin Evans. There's another doctor on here? I've just been crediting Dr. Hannah Fry. I'm so sorry, Dr. Thomas. So sorry. Go out and grab it by any legal means necessary. Borrow it from a friend, borrow it from a library, buy it at a bookstore, buy it on a Kindle. I don't care what you do as long as it's legal. And you read it before I ruin it for you. I've been Elliot the Purple-Haired Doofus reminding you to watch your gym readies. And I will see you all in the conclusion of American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Toodles!